In the early 1990s, 37.7 million people watched a Looney Tunes cartoon every single week. Bugs Bunny was voted the greatest cartoon character ever made, above Mickey Mouse and SpongeBob. Warner Brothers owned the most beloved, most recognized animated franchise in history. Now, it seems like the Looney Tunes are nowhere to be found. So how is it possible to take one of the most popular franchises ever and reduce it to rubble? What could have possibly gone so wrong? Well, through some of the worst decisions a studio has ever made, that Warner Brothers doesn't want you to know about because you will struggle to believe it. This is the story of how Warner Brothers destroyed one of the greatest animated franchises of all time. And the more I dug, the worse and crazier it got. See, most people don't realize how massive the Looney Tunes were at their peak. The Looney Tunes began as a series of animated short films in direct response to Disney's own short films that had become extremely popular in the 30s. Between the 1930s and the 1960s, Warner Brothers Animation produced what many historians consider the greatest body of work in the entire history of the medium. Tex Avery, Chuck Jones, Mel Blanc, and so many others played a key part in developing the Looney Tunes we know and love. They were geniuses making 7-minute shorts for cinema audiences before the main movie. They worked in a rundown bungalow on the Warner Brothers lot that everyone called Termite Terrace. One of the reasons the execs at Warner Brothers essentially left them alone. Leon Schlesinger cared about the bottom line, not the content. And so what emerged was near total creative freedom. Different directors developing completely distinct styles, animators improvising gags on the fly. The characters they created became the most recognizable animated figures on the planet, and I'm not exaggerating. By the 1940s, Looney Tunes shorts were being shown in cinemas across the entire world, and the characters had achieved a level of recognition that most Hollywood stars at the time couldn't match. The shorts were often what people were most excited to watch, not the movie that came after. I mean, Bugs even appeared on the nose cone of American World War II bombers. And things only got bigger from there. When television arrived and Saturday morning cartoons became the norm for children, Looney Tunes completely dominated the format for over 3 decades. 37.7 million viewers every single week by the early 90s. That's more people watching a Bugs Bunny cartoon on a Saturday morning than the entire population of Australia every single week. The franchise was worth an estimated $17 billion, and nearly a third of TV Guide's 50 greatest cartoon characters of all time were Warner Brothers characters. Bugs Bunny alone has more movie appearances than any other cartoon character in history, and has his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. But there's a key reason for that, which purely boiled down to how creative and unique they were. These shorts were chaotic, subversive, and genuinely adult in their humor, full of political satire, pop culture references, and a kind of gleeful, unhinged chaos that we haven't gotten since in animation. Chuck Jones made an entire short in which Daffy Duck is tormented by his own animator. I mean, the fourth wall breaks were ingenious. Bugs even famously challenged masculinity and gender, often appearing in drag at least 45 separate times in an era where that wasn't really socially acceptable. These were brilliant and radical ideas at the time, animated as cartoons, plus an audience that genuinely loved these characters with a ferocity that most IP owners would kill for. Yet Warner Brothers managed it as heinously as humanly possible. And the worst part was that the damage started while the Looney Tunes was still at its peak. What makes it so frustrating is that the collapse started earlier than most people think. Back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Warner Brothers had a golden generation in studio. They made around 1,000 theatrical shorts. Yet in 1963, when TV was soaring in popularity and cinema attendance was plummeting, Warner Brothers just shut them down. They were losing money on most of their shorts, and instead of finding a solution, they said, fuck it. Chuck Jones, one of the most important directors in the studio's history, the man behind some of the greatest shorts ever produced, was fired for working on another project outside of his contract. They replaced the in-house studio with cheap outsourced production, operating on razor-thin television budgets, and the quality collapsed immediately, obviously. The chaotic-ass energy and brilliantly unique humor that had defined the shorts for 3 decades disappeared. Instead of trying to find a workaround, Warner Brothers seemed to have just accepted that this studio just just didn't have a future. Clearly, execs thought that they were expendable when it became inconvenient. But funnily enough, closing the studio didn't hurt the franchise at all, because Warner Brothers had already been licensing those classic theatrical shorts to television since 1955, and they were a massive hit. Kids who had never seen them in cinemas were watching Bugs Bunny every afternoon after school. So when the studio closed in 1963, it didn't really matter, because they already had plenty of content to run on TV. Warner Brothers just kept repackaging the same pool of pre-1963 shorts, reusing them like a band whose music keeps getting played on the radio, even though the band broke up decades ago. They didn't make any new animation for nearly 30 years. Yes, obviously the work their animation studio had done was so good and timeless that it just kept generating audiences and revenue long after the people who made it were gone. But after so much animated success, to just abandon it like that proves they were lacking brain cells. Warner Brothers clearly saw the Looney Tunes as a library to be exploited rather than a creative endeavor to be invested in. What came next made it so much worse though. By the mid-1980s, Warner Brothers did what any self-respecting company would do: squeeze as much money from these characters as humanly possible. The characters were increasingly being used in ads. Nike, McDonald's, KFC. The commercials became so relentless and ubiquitous that by the early 90s, the character's identity had started to become divorced from their actual shorts and tied instead to whatever brand was writing the biggest check that week. This was the period when the Warner Brothers studio stores opened across America. Over 100 locations at their peak, and on paper, it looked like success. The franchise was generating serious money, but what was really happening was a slow shift in how Warner Brothers thought about these characters, which would come back to bite them in a horrible way. There's actually a really revealing moment that captures exactly how Warner Brothers was losing its way, and it comes from one of the most successful uses of the Looney Tunes in history: Who Framed Roger Rabbit in 1988. One of the most unique and beloved movies of the time. Warner Brothers allowed their characters into that movie for only $5,000 a character. Yeah, you heard that right. That's less than what some influencers charge for one Instagram post. There was just one non-negotiable condition though. Bugs and Daffy had to have the exact same screen time as Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. They didn't care whether their characters were used well, just whether they were on screen as long as Disney's, which is just petty and tells you how little vision and ambition Warner Brothers had for their characters. This wasn't the only example of Warner Brothers' lack of ambition for the Looney Tunes, but we'll get to the next one soon, and it was an even bigger movie. Despite the issues, though, the Looney Tunes continued to do incredibly well into the early 90s. The Saturday morning ABC slot had held the #1 rating for 32 consecutive years. That's an insane run. That single hour of Bugs Bunny was generating an estimated $8 to $10 million annually for Warner Brothers, which would be like $25 million today. The studio stores were booming, with their flagship New York store drawing 20,000 people every day, more than 7 million people a year. On paper, the franchise had never looked healthier, which is exactly what made it so easy for Warner Brothers to convince themselves that whatever they were doing was working. Then Space Jam happened in 1996, one of the weirdest crossovers, yet one of the most popular movies of the time, which only happened because two Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny ads did so well for Nike that they decided a movie needed to happen. But what Space Jam represented for Looney Tunes as a franchise was catastrophic, because Space Jam existed simply to sell more Michael Jordan merch. And Warner Brothers said yes because the collab was music to the ears of their execs, and it worked to the tune of $230 million at the box office. So obviously Warner Brothers learned exactly the right lesson. Let's keep using Looney Tunes as ad fodder. A critic from the New York Times made it clear this was a fond tribute to the Looney Tunes' past. Its present had become a way to sell stuff for other companies. But nobody would have envisioned what happened in the years after Space Jam. The first blow came from the FCC. In the 1990s, the Children's Television Act and later FCC rules pushed broadcast networks toward more educational programming. And over time, that helped squeeze that old Saturday morning cartoon block almost out of existence. Looney Tunes had dominated that slot for decades, so the shift quietly took away one of the last places the franchise had been truly unavoidable. Now, to be fair, Warner Warner Brothers had no control over this, and every other animation studio was dealing with it simultaneously. But the difference is that Warner Brothers relied on this slot. It was its main content pipeline. Disney had theatrical releases, they had theme parks, multiple distribution pipelines that weren't dependent on that Saturday morning TV slot. But the FCC was just part of the problem. In '96, we got Warner Brothers and Turner merging, where Cartoon Network became part of Warner Brothers, which should have been a great thing. And at first it was, briefly, with Cartoon Network running comprehensive Looney Tunes programming blocks and making the classics more accessible than they had been in years. But the internal structure of the deal was a disaster waiting to happen. Warner Brothers actually made Cartoon Network pay money to air the Looney Tunes shorts, which is so dumb. They were literally part of the same company. But anyway, at the same time as this was happening, a different merger just continued the Looney Tunes beatdown. AOL merged with Time Warner at the height of the dot-com bubble, and everything got even worse. It saddled the company with enormous debt, created years of internal chaos, and forced them to sell anything they could, including all the Warner Brothers studio stores, which had been a major part of keeping these characters relevant. All of their domestic stores were gone in under 12 months. Looney Tunes became an afterthought for a company that needed to prioritize saving itself. Their Temu Space Jam Back in Action ended up bombing around the same time frame, and within a year, Cartoon Network dropped the classic Looney Tunes shorts from its schedule almost entirely. Partly because of its failure, partly because of a Cartoon Network rebranding, nobody at Warner Brothers seemed to step in and protect the characters from the damage. Since Looney Tunes was exclusively on Cartoon Network at the time, that was a massive blow. A single box office flop was enough to get their most iconic franchise banished to the much smaller Boomerang. All of this made it so that from 2004 to 2009, there was essentially no Looney Tunes on mainstream television. An entire generation of children grew up with near zero exposure to any of the characters. There was some content throughout the 2000s like Back in Action, which I mentioned and do actually remember liking as a kid, Duck Dodgers, which was one of the few bright spots for the Looney Tunes in this era, and Lunatics Unleashed, which some people really loved, but a lot of people hated on. Most of these didn't really do anything positive for the Looney Tunes' popularity, and Back in Action did so badly that it led to the canceling of a bunch of projects, also marking the end of theatrical Looney Tunes until 18 years later. There's a pretty absurd comparison that puts this into hilarious perspective. By 2010, Disney was generating around $5 billion annually from Winnie the Pooh merchandise, while Looney Tunes had collapsed to around $1 billion. Winnie the Pooh, as great as he is, should never have been out-earning the Looney Tunes by 5 times. And if you think that's embarrassing, wait until you see what Warner Brothers tried to do to fix it. Chuck Jones once said that Jack Warner spent 30 years thinking the cartoons were filler, cheap product to pad out cinema programs before the real movies started. What the 2000s proved pretty definitively is that attitude never actually left Warner Brothers' DNA, which is why in 2010, Warner Brothers finally realized how ridiculously far they had dropped the ball. The New York Times came out with an article detailing Warner Brothers' 5-alarm rescue effort for the franchise, which started with actually making their characters look and behave like the versions that had made them famous in the first place. Didn't take them long at all to figure that out. They even hung art from Lunatics Unleashed to remind them what not to do. They finally tried in this era, albeit inconsistently and disappointingly. The Looney Tunes show in 2011 did pretty well. It was a sitcom-style reboot placing Bugs and Daffy as suburban roommates, which is a pretty fun idea, to be honest. But it fundamentally misunderstood the characters by stripping out the chaos that defined them and replacing it with domestic sitcom plots, and after 2 seasons, it was canceled. Around the same time, Warner Brothers attempted to revive the idea of Looney Tunes theatrical shorts, something they'd actually tried once already after Back in Action bombed. They tried again in 2010 with a run of 3D Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner shorts playing before family movies, and then stopped again with zero explanation. Why? Literally no idea. Wabbit came out in 2015 and got cancelled in short order because it sucked. And then in 2020, Warner Brothers actually made something good Looney Tunes cartoons launched as one of HBO Max's very first original series, short-form, hand-drawn animation with different artists and styles, which is awesome. They were actually trying to recapture what made the originals feel alive. It launched to really positive reviews and was one of the most watched series on the platform in its early weeks, even beating out Game of Thrones. But right when it seemed like Warner Brothers had finally figured it out, they somehow managed to ruin it anyway. Since those first weeks, we got basically zero other information from Warner Brothers, which I imagine means the show just lost any hype it had. They gave it almost zero marketing support or really any effort to convert that early momentum into something lasting. 6 seasons of the most promising Looney Tunes content in decades, and Warner Brothers just kind of let it fade into the background. The problem is, no one's going on a streaming platform to watch shorts. We already have enough of that on social media. Warner Brothers has never adapted the Looney Tunes into something modern, infusing the slapstick chaotic comedy into serialized narrative content while letting the shorts thrive on social media. It's so frustrating to continuously see the absolute lack of effort and vision that they had with one of the most famous animated IP ever. Luckily though, it gets much worse. Because in December of 2022, Warner Brothers removed 256 classic Looney Tunes shorts from HBO Max, including What's Up, Red Dog and Duck Amuck, 2 of the most celebrated and studied pieces of animation ever made. Wild. All thanks to one wonderful man called David Zaslav. Someone who gave absolutely no shits about this IP was now the one responsible for it due to the Discovery and Warner merger. This is when things started feeling way more deliberate. David Zaslav came in and immediately began treating the company's entire creative catalog as a financial problem rather than one of the greatest animated legacies of all time. The day the Earth blew up, a new Looney Tunes movie was shelved until Ketchup Entertainment had to come and rescue it, releasing it in theaters last year with barely any marketing whatsoever. Then there's the whole Coyote versus Acme debacle. Warner Brothers finished the movie in 2023, screened it, and then decided they wouldn't release it so they could claim a tax write-off without even communicating it to the team involved until after the movie was done. People went crazy, obviously, and forced Warner Brothers to reverse course in only 4 days, which is impressive. Warner Brothers later allowed it to be shopped to outside buyers, and there were a ton of great studios interested, including Netflix and Sony, but none of them met the super high price that Warner Brothers wanted for the movie. Thankfully though, in 2025, Ketchup Entertainment once again came to save the day, bought it, and set it for a 2026 release. The ugly part though is that this wasn't a one-off embarrassment. It was part of a broader pattern under Zaslav of canceling finished projects, cutting costs first, and worrying about creative value second, which led to the biggest part of the controversy surrounding Zaslav. Throughout the years since 2022, they continued to remove shorts until March 2025, when Warner Brothers removed every single remaining original Looney Tunes short from Max, all 255 that were left. Decades of animation history just thrown in the trash in a few years. And the official reasoning was that children's programming was no longer a priority. What? The original shorts were for general audiences, not necessarily for kids. Plus, even if family content isn't a priority, removing such a foundational and key piece of your history from your platform is ridiculous. The timing of this is what really gets me though, because they did it the exact same weekend they released The Day the Earth Blew Up, the first Looney Tunes theatrical movie in 20 years. So on one hand, Warner Brothers is asking audiences to go to cinemas and reconnect with those characters, and on the other hand, they're simultaneously making it impossible to watch the classic cartoons that made those characters worth caring about in the first place. It's baffling. One of the most egregious, nonsensical things a major studio has ever done. And while all of this was happening, they were also demolishing the building where hundreds of original Looney Tunes shorts were made in the 50s and 60s. They just didn't give a fuck about anything related to the Looney Tunes. Cartoon Brew put it best. CEO David Zaslav is continuing his systematic crusade to dismantle Warner Brothers' animation legacy, and he's doing it with the kind of thoroughness that borders on obsession. And this is just one of a ton of other idiotic moves. But why did this all happen? Well, the reasons are more grim than you'd expect. For one, Warner Brothers has never actually understood what Looney Tunes was. Chuck Jones was right. The Looney Tunes seem to be just filler for Warner Brothers. Every time Warner Brothers has engaged with Looney Tunes since the 90s, it's been to either make money from merch or to touch on nostalgia, never with genuine creative investment. They failed to adapt the brand to how audiences actually consume content in the modern day, which is especially absurd because Looney Tunes was literally built for short form. With the right marketing and social media strategy, these characters should be everywhere. Most of their reels or TikToks barely cross 100,000 views. That's insane to me. They're sitting on a short form gold mine and not even trying to make the most of it. Not only that, they've sanded down the one thing that made the characters special in the first place, the edginess and gall. The chaotic adult wit of the original shorts doesn't fit neatly into the safe, we won't offend anyone content that modern Hollywood is all about. So rather than embrace what Looney Tunes actually is, they've spent 3 decades sanding them down and Disney-fying the characters. Add to that the constant mergers, acquisitions, changing of execs over the past 20-30 years, and of course there isn't going to be a set, cohesive content strategy. With the new merger of Warner Brothers and Paramount looming, who knows how things will change again. Zaslav accelerated something that has been happening for ages though. He's unfortunately only the tip of the iceberg. But despite everything Warner Brothers did to bury this franchise, something surprising happened. There's actually some hope, because thankfully, the original Warner Brothers shorts ended up on Fox's Tubi, a free streaming service with a ton of content, and they became one of the most watched catalogs on the entire platform, jumping into the top 10 by viewing time almost immediately. They're also in active talks to keep the content for years. Warner Brothers abandoned Looney Tunes, but people still love watching them. According to Parrot Analytics, the franchise has generated more than $300 million in global subscriber revenue from the first quarter of 2020 to the second quarter of 2025, with $250 million of this coming from HBO Max. Which makes it even more dumbfounding as to why they would remove any Looney Tunes content. In early 2026, TCM signed a 6-year deal to return the classic shorts to TV with proper context and presentation. And Warner Brothers themselves seem to be slowly and somewhat reluctantly waking up. Co-CEO Pam Abdi has said they're committed to bringing Looney Tunes back to the big screen and announced a new short called Daffy Season, which premiered at Annecy a couple weeks ago. A Speedy Gonzalez film is in production, and reports indicate significant plans for the franchise rolling out from 2028, including a secret theatrical project already in development. Obviously, words and announcements aren't movies, and commitments are not releases. And Warner Brothers has explicitly promised to value Looney Tunes before, and then not done it. But the fact that demand and passion still seems to be going strong is huge. That's proof that what Chuck Jones and Tex Avery built was so genuinely good and irreplaceable that it survived 3 decades of buffoonery with a fan base that still loves it with the same ferocity it always did. Bugs Bunny has outlasted every exec who's mishandled him. He'll probably outlast Zaslav and any others as well.